Hello. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Scrum, which is an agile software development management approach, which promotes rapid feedback cycles with a big emphasis on the value of the product and its cost. Okay, from the point of view of the value, what they do is that they define a product backlog where you add all the stories that you consider that may be relevant. So all the stories that may be relevant for the final functionality of the product. And you have the product owner, which is responsible, so which is the domain expert from the product point of view, and that is responsible to add stories there and assign to each story the value that the story has from the point of view of the business. So some stories are more relevant than others. Usually we have a rule that is the 80%, 20% rule that says that 20% of the functionalities usually have 80% of impact on the business. So it's important that you have these and basically you we identify which ones are more have more impact in business because probably they are the ones that are more relevant to implement first. Then you have cost. And when you think about cost, is that now the development team should look at each one of these stories and try to understand what is going to be the cost. And actually, what we are talking now is about estimating, so estimation of the cost. And this is particularly important. Why? Because they need to assign these stories to a sprint in order to implement as I'm going to explain it. Okay? So, but the main point here is that when you have these stories, you need to know what is going to be the cost associated with each implementation. And they follow basically a top-down approach, a bottom-up approach, where you define for each story, you compare the stories. So they play a game. They call it a game, where you compare the stories and say, well, this story is basically more difficult than that story. So they don't try to define a complete and absolute value of the cost of the story, but they relate the stories in terms of the level of difficulty of the story or the level of complexity. Once they have related the stories in terms of complexity, what they are going to do is that they observe what occurred in the past in the development and see what stories were implemented, which stories were implemented, and the complexity of these stories. In that way, they can calculate what they call the velocity. And the velocity basically is the number of complexity of stories that they can implement during a period of time. And what they are going to do when they do planning is that they define a period for the next sprint, okay? And they're going to pick the stories that have the complexity that can be implemented during this period, according to the known velocity of the team. So, how does it work? So, you have the product backlog where you have all the stories, and these stories have already a value that is assigned by the product owner that knows the business. And then you're going to define a sprint. And suppose that this sprint is 3 weeks. And you know that during 3 weeks your team is able to implement a certain level of complexity in the stories. Who is going to choose the stories that are going to be in the sprint? Well, who knows about the business? Is going to be the product owner. Who decides how many stories or many complexity is going to be implemented during the sprint? The team, because the team knows their ability or their capacity to implement stories according to their complexity. So when you define what is called the sprint backlog, is a discussion between the product owner that says, well, these are the the functionalities or the stories that have more value for the business now, and you will be really happy if you can have this functionality soon. And then the number of stories that are going to be implemented or that are going to be in the sprint is decided by the team related to the complexity. Then, when you start the sprint, what is going to happen is that, so you have this perspective that you're going to be able to implement that level of complexity in terms of stories. Usually it's called story points. And what you're going to do is that you're going to assess every day if you are actually able to deliver that amount of work. So you're going to realize whether actually your velocity is increasing or decreasing. And what they do is, if it is increasing the velocity, you may ask the product owner to add more stories, because actually during this period of the sprint, we'll be able to do more work. If the opposite occurs, so if the velocity reduces, you're going to ask the product owner to remove the stories that they consider less relevant from the sprint. So what is the main idea? Is that if you decide the sprint is going to take 1 month, it's going to take 1 month. And this is important so that you keep this idea of short feedback cycles. It means that whatever happens, after 1 month, we will have new functionality implemented that can be tested and used by the end users, and they can provide feedback about what is done. So each sprint defines a feedback period. So what are the roles involved in Scrum, in the Scrum approach? I talk about the product owner, I talk about the developer, and then you have the Scrum Master. So the idea of the Scrum Master is that he's not a project manager, in the sense that usually you look at the project manager that controls the work of people. He's more like a facilitator, that in the sense that it tries that everybody is focused on what they have to do. So the team is focused on developing, the product owner is focusing on defining the stories and verifying that the stories are implemented in the final product, which is doing acceptance testing. Before I show you some figures about the process associated with Scrum, a last note about what actually is a story. So the idea of the story is that, related to what I already talked about, how long does it take you to define the requirements? The story is basically a description of something that needs to be implemented in the software, and the level of detail of this description is just enough to define two things: the value and the cost, the complexity of the story. So why is this possible? Because the product owner, that actually is the domain expert, is working with the team. So when the developers have some question about or ask concrete aspects about the story, they ask the product owner. Okay? The opposite would be to write a complete description of a functionality, such that the developers can, by reading this complete description, implement it without asking the sources of the requirement. Okay? This is more traditional approaches, and in this type of approaches you try to reduce the requirements phase to basically identifying value and identifying complexity, and then you have a much closer relation between developers and product owners, so between the people of the business and the developers. Okay? As we'll talk later, this is a multi-functional team. Okay? So you focus on development, so the software development teams are multifunctional in the sense that you don't have only developers, you have people from the business, you have people that do testing and so on. So you can find a lot of sources about this. For instance, in Wikipedia, you have a pretty nice description of Scrum, and I have these pictures here, and here you can see what I told you about, the product backlog, where the product owner is responsible to create. Then you have the sprint backlogs, and where you just create the team forecasts who are needed to achieve the sprint goal. So where you calculate the cost, you define the cost, and then you have the iterations and you incrementally build your product. Okay? Of course, at the end you have sprint reviews. Usually you can have daily Scrum meetings that occur every morning. So you have a few techniques that you use in order that so that you have to foster communication between everybody. Okay, that's one of the main ideas here. Okay, and this is a similar picture. You have the product backlog with the stories, and here you have already the stories for the sprint. Sometimes you just pick the stories and you divide the stories into tasks. Okay, and what is very common in this type of things is to have something like this that actually is what you are using in GitHub. Okay, actually this is more usable, so if you have a team that is developing in the room, they use this kind of thing to identify the stories and the tasks and identify how the things are progressing. Okay, another thing that you can have is these burn down charts, and in the burn down charts they basically analyze what I've said about velocity. So this is the amount, this is the amount of work to do, and this is, according to this line, you keep the velocity, okay? And this case is our case where you keep changing, but as I told you, you always finish, in this case, on the 21st day, but what you do is you add and remove stories as your velocity changes. Okay? I think it's an introduction for this. Now you please read the material, and good work.